A good anime MMO is about as elusive as a girlfriend. You're in this perpetual state of searching for the perfect person to dedicate your life to, only to be rejected repeatedly. Yet, we strive onwards, ever looking towards the future, for the one single moment of reprieve, only to never find it. And that is where I come in. Hey, my name is Stix and welcome to the channel. I am about as big an anime fan as anyone. I love anime, I love anime games. I have been enamored with this genre ever since I was a kid. And while I'm still, one mentally, physically, I'm responsible for doing adult things now. At least that's what Mrs Stix tells me. She's just not aware that I don't necessarily listen. Now, every year it seems as though we have less and less of a selection. Quick shout out to our patrons over on Patreon. This allows you to directly support us if you're interested. Every patron will have their name appear at the beginning of every single YouTube video, and you'll be immortalized in the MMO genre forever. But that by no means means that there are no good anime MMOs to play. Quite the contrary, that just means that the titles left are titles that have stood the test of time and are the best our genre has to offer. And while you might argue some of these don't necessarily belong here, I do want to note that these are what I believe are the current best anime MMOs to invest your time into. Now, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start this off with Aura Kingdom. This is the most recent title from X Legend remaining online, as Twin Saga actually shut down last year, meaning it is the most updated traditional anime MMO left. Aura Kingdom released back in 2013 and has retained a community of loyal players. Aura Kingdom also follows the traditional anime formula. The world is segregated, meaning that each zone has a loading screen separating it from other areas, much like Guild Wars 2 or Final Fantasy XIV. You take and complete quests, you move from hub to hub, leveling, unlocking new features. The combat is a simple tab target system, abilities look decent overall. The game feels pretty fluid given it's almost a decade old now, and given its age, it's still pretty damn aesthetically appealing. Its population, however, is on the lower end of the spectrum though, not as low as the vast majority of anime MMOs, but still pretty low. Dragon Nest is an MMO that has shifted publisher more times than I can count, and every single time, players have followed. Because at the end of the day, if you enjoy a game, you'll continue to play it regardless of who publishes it. Dragon Nest released way back in 2010 and went on to be considered one of the greatest anime MMOs of its generation. Even today, many players consider this game to have not only some of the best action combat, but also PvP of any anime title. And while I never got to experience this game firsthand during its prime, I did get to stream it recently, and I'll admit its action combat system is definitely better than most anime MMOs, but its PvP scene was not nearly as active during the times when I played. Unlike Aura Kingdom, Dragon Nest is more of an instanced hub MMO with hundreds of unique dungeons to run, a surplus of different town hubs, and a plethora of different classes to choose from. This means, however, that you can't just run around an open world and meet other players, but you can still group up and tackle content with them. Unfortunately, its population is also fairly low, but that does not stop people from enjoying the game, as there are enough people left playing to keep things relatively active. This is arguably one of the newest titles in the list, releasing just back in 2019, and while it is a newer release, it is also one of the more unique titles, as while this game did launch recently onto PC, it is also available completely cross-platform on mobile devices too. There are very few decent cross-platform MMOs. Dragon Raja just so happens to be one of a small handful. Dragon Raja utilizes an interesting hybrid combat system with very flashy special effects. It has a segregated world, but the world itself is actually enormous. It has a strong narrative. Given the type of game that it is, typically anime MMOs, or rather MMOs in general, have this absence of story. That is not the case here, and with a fully voice-acted narrative, this game definitely comes out on top. It also has one of the larger populations of all the anime titles included, but that's thanks to its cross-platform functionality. Dungeon Fighter Online is by far the most populated game in this list, with tens of millions of active players within China alone and millions of players spread throughout the world. By those numbers alone, this is also the most played MMORPG spread across the entire globe, which is crazy. Dungeon Fighter Online launched all the way back in 2005, back during the golden age of the genre, when new titles were coming out every month, when everyone wanted a small piece of the genre to capitalize on. Dungeon Fighter is an interesting title though, in so that unlike your typical over-the-shoulder third-person graphical style, this game utilizes a horizontal side-scrolling perspective, with players moving our characters horizontally, left to right, to not only move, but to also fight. Speaking of fighting, the action combat in this game is crazy. The further you get through the game, the crazier things get. You start flying all over the screen, your attacks grow larger in scale, taking up more and more of the screen. It's gorgeous, unless you're weird and dislike mass quantities of special effects taking up your entire screen. In which case you probably don't really like Final Fantasy XIV either. Like Dragon Nest, this is a hub MMO, meaning that you'll see players in towns, but outside of towns, you'll be running a plethora of different dungeons, thus its fairly descriptive name. Elsword released back in 2007. Yeah, quite a few of these games actually released back before 2010, but don't worry, we do have a couple newer titles towards the end. Elsword is also one of the handful of horizontal MMOs, with the only other games off the top of my head being MapleStory, Dungeon Fighter, Closers, and Grand Chase. Unlike Dungeon Fighter, however, which does have various town hubs where you can see and engage with other players, Elsword, while it features a variety of different dungeons to run and has the same general gameplay loop, allows for you to navigate outside of towns and cities between different zones, engaging enemies and participating in content with other players. So technically, this is both a segregated MMO and at the same time kind of a dungeon crawler combined. The combat is action oriented and is of a pretty decent quality, honestly, which, you know what, is kind of a must given that that is the bulk of the game. I believe the population is also still doing fairly well, given how long this game has been available and given who the publisher is. FlyFF is an MMO released back in, holy crap, man, I actually no-life this game for an entire year, but dude, 2004? Are we serious? This game does not look or feel like it was released almost 2 decades ago, but here we are, 2004, jeez. FlyFF is a very traditional anime MMO. Much like Aura Kingdom, the game world is pretty large, but it utilizes segregated zones, meaning that there are small loading screens between each area. You take your quests, you move between your hubs, and you level. At one point, you do unlock flying as well, which allows for an entirely new method of transportation and exploration. I remember when I unlocked it for the first time, it was the single coolest moment of any MMO that I had played up until that point, flying around on my little broomstick. Combat is tab target, and abilities and animations are honestly pretty basic. They're nothing great, but they're not boring by any stretch of the imagination. When I last played this, just last year to acquire some footage, there were hundreds of players around the beginning town, so I'd say that there are still enough people that are actively playing, or at least actively logging in, to warrant you downloading it if you so desire. Mabinogi should realistically be the king of the anime MMO genre, but it isn't, even though it is by far the most unique MMO that I've had the pleasure of playing. Mabinogi, released back in 2004, and along with FlyFF, is the oldest MMO in this list. This game is gorgeous, like not in the traditional sense where you look at something like Black Desert and you're like, man, the graphical fidelity of every particle transcends my understanding, but where it just looks so unique that you've never seen another game like it. Adding to its unique style is its combat, which admittedly can only be described as rock, paper, scissors, point and click. I think I'd need several minutes here to explain the system in detail, the unique intricacies of its combat system, and to fully make sense of it, but this is about as close as you'll get. The world is enormous, and given the slow speed with which you traverse its segregated zones, it can take a very long time to get around. Even though it released almost 2 decades ago, it still retains quite a few players, enough where whenever I log into and stream it, I have groups of people stalking me wherever I go. PSO2 New Genesis is one of the newer titles in this list, releasing back in 2021. This is arguably one of the best looking, best playing anime MMOs in this list. There's only a single other anime title that looks and plays as well as this, and that is coming up shortly. Unlike its predecessor, PSO2, New Genesis takes the hub MMO style and turns it on its head, transforming the game into a segregated world. This means that while you can see players out in the towns that you'll find, you'll also be capable of seeing large numbers of them out in the world too. PSO2 New Genesis utilizes some of the fastest, most fluid action combat of an anime title in this genre. Character creation is very highly extensive, and they have an emphasis on the plot, something that I think is missing from a lot of games these days. There's a narrative present, but unfortunately the narrative is very stretched out, very spread out, and gated behind an arduous level grind. There are tens of thousands of active players at any moment of the day, so the game is far from inactive. Soul Worker is my favorite anime MMO. It always has been, and likely always will be. This game was released back in 2016, and I have been playing it ever since. This game is gorgeous. It has some of the best looking character models in the subgenre, a ton of story to make your way through, even if at times it does get a little bit repetitious, and some of the greatest action combat that I have had the pleasure of interacting with. I've always enjoyed the combat in Soul Worker. It's fast, it's flashy, it's fluid, abilities feel impactful, everything looks and feels so perfectly crafted. Unfortunately, it is a hub MMO, meaning that players that don't find enjoyment in running dungeons repeatedly will likely find themselves bored relatively quickly. After finding its way back to its original developer, the game has found quite a bit of success with thousands of active players playing every day. Finally, Tower Fantasy. This is an MMO that held its closed beta last year and launched just a couple months ago within China. This game is releasing this year in English and will easily become the #1 most played anime MMO of 2022. This game is stunning. The world, the environments, the characters, and the extent with which you can craft your ideal perfect avatar. The world itself is large and open. The action combat is incredibly fast and is perhaps some of the flashiest I've seen in the subgenre. The game is full of voice acting and has quite a strong narrative. Tower Fantasy is also completely cross-platform compatible between PC, console, and mobile devices, much like Genshin Impact, increasing the population exponentially. I cannot wait for the rest of the world to get to try this game out. And that right there is it. Those are 10 anime MMOs that I think everyone should consider playing if you're in the mood for an anime MMO and are potentially looking for something to waste your time in. Now, if you're looking for a list of the most played MMOs, because these games aren't necessarily the largest, most populated ones, then I have a list for that right over here.